This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on this fascinating journey across the Pacific. Today, we'll explore one of history's most intriguing encounters, the meeting between Polynesian voyagers and the peoples of South America. Long before European explorers charted these waters, ancient navigators crossed thousands of miles of open ocean, carrying with them plants, culture, and perhaps even genetic connections that would link two distant civilizations. Through archaeology, genetics, and the study of shared crops like the sweet potato, we'll uncover evidence of these remarkable transoceanic contacts and what they reveal about human ingenuity and exploration. Chapter 1. Who sailed to whom? Imagine standing on the coast of Peru, looking out across the endless Pacific Ocean. The waves crash against the shore, and somewhere beyond the horizon, thousands of miles away, lie tiny islands scattered across the world's largest ocean. Now imagine someone telling you that people crossed this vast expanse not in modern ships, but in wooden canoes and rafts, hundreds of years before Europeans even knew these waters existed. The question that has captivated scientists, explorers, and storytellers for decades is simple to ask, but fiendishly difficult to answer. Who sailed to whom? Did the masterful Polynesian navigators venture all the way to the shores of South America, or did Native Americans from the coast of what we now call Colombia and Ecuador somehow drift westward across the Pacific to reach remote island chains? This debate has raged for generations, and it strikes at the heart of how we understand human exploration, courage, and the drive to discover what lies beyond the horizon. The stakes are higher than mere academic curiosity. The answer tells us something profound about human capability, about the seafaring skills of ancient peoples, and about connections between cultures separated by one of the most formidable barriers on Earth. The story of this great debate truly caught fire on a spring day in 1947, when a Norwegian explorer named Thor Heyerdahl set out to prove what most scientists thought was ridiculous. Heyerdahl had developed a theory that went against everything the academic establishment believed about Pacific settlement. He argued that Polynesia was initially populated by South Americans who had drifted or sailed westward from the coast of Peru. To prove his point, he didn't write another paper or give another lecture. Instead, he built a raft using only materials and techniques available to ancient South Americans, christened it the Kon-Tiki, and set sail from the Peruvian coast with a small crew. What followed became one of the most famous voyages of the 20th century. Heyerdahl and his crew drifted on the prevailing winds and currents for more than 4,300 miles, eventually reaching Roroya Atoll in French Polynesia. The journey took months, during which the men battled storms, sharks, and the constant threat that their balsa wood raft might simply fall apart beneath them. When they finally stumbled onto land, sunburned and half-starved but triumphant, Heyerdahl had demonstrated something undeniable. It was physically possible for people from South America to reach Polynesia using primitive watercraft. The Kon-Tiki expedition made Heyerdahl world-famous. His book became an international bestseller, and the documentary film of the voyage won an Academy Award. Suddenly, the idea that South American peoples might have settled the Pacific Islands didn't seem quite so crazy. After all, here was proof that the ocean currents and winds would naturally carry a vessel from Peru directly to the heart of Polynesia. If Heyerdahl could do it in 1947, why couldn't ancient peoples have done the same thing 1,000 years earlier? But the scientific community wasn't buying it. For decades, researchers had been building a different picture of Pacific settlement, one based on linguistic evidence, archaeological remains, and cultural practices. Everything pointed to a migration pattern moving from west to east, from Asia through the islands of the Pacific, not from east to west from the Americas. The Polynesian languages showed clear connections to languages spoken in Southeast Asia. The pottery styles, the agricultural practices, the social structures, all of these seem to trace back to Asian origins, not American ones. The pushback against Heyerdahl's theory was swift and often harsh. Scientists pointed out that proving something was possible didn't mean it actually happened. Yes, a raft could drift from South America to Polynesia, but that didn't mean it did. The problem with the drift hypothesis was that it required an awful lot of lucky accidents. Coastal trading vessels would need to be blown off course, caught in exactly the right currents, and somehow survive the journey with enough people alive to establish a population on whatever island they happened to reach. It was possible, certainly, but was it likely? And yet the currents and winds did flow in exactly the right direction. If people in boats plying coastal trade routes were blown off course or drifting to sea, those same currents and winds might have taken them to Pacific islands. The ocean itself seemed to offer a natural highway from South America westward. But this scenario required passive victims of circumstance, not intentional explorers. It imagined desperate people clinging to damaged boats, not confident navigators setting out to discover new lands. This became the fundamental divide in the debate: accident versus intention, drift versus navigation, luck versus skill. The alternative explanation, the one that most scientists found far more compelling, was that the Polynesians themselves had reached South America. These were skilled navigators who had conquered the Pacific through remarkable seafaring abilities. By around 1200 CE, Polynesians had settled islands across the Pacific, including Easter Island, just 2,200 miles from the coast of South America. This is a crucial point in the debate. If Polynesians could reach Easter Island, they had already sailed well to the east of where North America begins, even though they were in the southern hemisphere. They had proven they could navigate across vast stretches of empty ocean and find tiny islands. So why wouldn't they keep going? As archaeologist David Burley put it, a North American group from Colombia making it to the southern Marquesas and interbreeding with Polynesians seemed like a stretch. Polynesian seafarers had well-developed maritime technologies and were quite capable of reaching the Americas. He wasn't at all sure that was the case for people from Colombia. This gets at the heart of the disagreement. On one side, you have the drift hypothesis, which requires South Americans to have been caught in currents and carried thousands of miles to islands they didn't know existed. On the other side, you have the intentional voyage hypothesis, which relies on the proven navigational skills of Polynesians, who had already demonstrated their ability to find and settle remote islands across the Pacific. One scenario asks us to believe in an extraordinary accident. The other asks us to believe in an extraordinary feat of navigation. Both seem improbable. Both seem possible. But there was evidence that complicated this neat division. The sweet potato presented a genuine mystery that both sides of the debate had to explain. This root vegetable, which was domesticated in South or Central America, was growing on Polynesian islands long before any European set foot in the Pacific. When the first European explorers arrived, they found sweet potatoes being cultivated on islands thousands of miles from the Americas. How did it get there? The linguistic evidence made the mystery even deeper. The Polynesian word for sweet potato, something like kuamala or kumara, depending on the specific island language, bore a striking resemblance to the words used in indigenous American languages in the Andes, kumara and kumal. This wasn't just a case of the plant being present. The word itself seemed to have traveled along with it. That suggested human contact, not just a plant seed floating across the ocean. Some scientists tried to argue that the sweet potato could have dispersed naturally, perhaps carried by ocean currents or birds. But this explanation strained credulity. The plant's seeds don't survive long periods in saltwater, and no known bird migration pattern could account for its spread across Polynesia. The sweet potato seemed to demand a human explanation. Someone had to have carried it, deliberately, from one place to another. For those who favored the Polynesian voyage theory, the sweet potato was evidence of exactly what they suspected. Polynesians had sailed to South America, encountered the plant there, recognized its value, and brought it back to their islands. They might have made this journey multiple times, establishing trade, or at least repeated contact. For those who favored some version of South American presence in Polynesia, the sweet potato was equally important evidence. Perhaps people from the Andes had brought their staple crop with them when they reached the islands. There were other tantalizing hints of connection beyond the sweet potato. On Easter Island, there was a ceremonial competition called the Birdman Cult, where competitors raced to collect the first egg of the season from a particular seabird species. Some researchers noticed similarities between these practices and certain South American cultural traditions. Were these similarities evidence of contact or just coincidence? People arguing both sides of the debate could look at the same evidence and reach opposite conclusions. The debate also touched on questions of capability and respect. Some felt that the drift hypothesis, intentionally or not, diminished the achievements of both Polynesian and Native American seafarers. It cast them as passive victims of ocean currents rather than active agents of exploration. Others felt that the Polynesian voyage hypothesis ignored perfectly reasonable ways that South Americans could have ended up in Polynesia, whether by accident or design. Modern fishermen from Latin America, even with relatively simple equipment, have occasionally been found drifting far out into the Pacific after being caught in currents. If it can happen now, it could certainly have happened then. It wouldn't take a fleet of vessels or a planned expedition. It could have been one raft lost in the Pacific, perhaps a trading vessel blown off course during a storm that eventually made landfall in the Marquesas or another island group, with some survivors still aboard. The reality, as is so often the case in these debates, might be more complex than either side wanted to admit. Perhaps both scenarios happened at different times or in different places. Perhaps there were multiple contacts between Pacific peoples and American peoples over the centuries, some intentional and some accidental, some involving Polynesians sailing east and others involving South Americans drifting west. What everyone could agree on was that the Pacific Ocean, vast as it is, was not an impenetrable barrier. People crossed it, somehow, and when they did, they carried with them plants, words, genes, and cultural practices that left traces we can still detect today. The question of who sailed to whom, of whether the story was one of masterful navigation or fortunate drift, of Polynesian discovery or South American accident, remained open. It was a debate that needed more than speculation and circumstantial evidence. It needed hard proof, the kind of evidence that could settle the question once and for all. And that evidence, it would turn out, was hidden in the most unexpected place, in the very cells of people living in the Pacific and South America today, in the chemical record of their DNA, waiting for the right technology and the right questions to reveal secrets that had been locked away for 800 years. Other geneticists who reviewed the study's findings were impressed by the strength of the evidence. Pontus Skoglund, a researcher at the Francis Crick Institute in London, called it fascinating new evidence. He was particularly intrigued by the evidence that Native Americans would have encountered Polynesians before they encountered Europeans, contrary to what some previous studies had shown. This was significant because it meant that the Native American ancestry detected in Polynesians wasn't due to events in more recent colonial history when trans-Pacific travel was well documented. This was something much older, something that predated the entire colonial era. The comprehensiveness of the data set was what really set this study apart. By including genetic samples from 15 different indigenous groups along the Pacific coast of South America, the team could compare the Polynesian genetic signatures against a wide range of possible source populations. They weren't just guessing at where the Native American DNA came from. They could match it with statistical confidence to specific groups of people living in specific regions. The study also included a handful of pre-Columbian DNA samples from South America, extracted from ancient remains. These samples served as a control, helping to confirm that the indigenous genetic signatures they were detecting in modern Polynesians really did come from pre-contact populations, and not from later mixing after Europeans arrived. The ancient samples matched the patterns they were seeing in modern South Americans, validating the approach. For the communities who participated, the study offered something valuable beyond academic knowledge. It told them something about their own history, about connections their ancestors had made across vast distances. It was a reminder that the Pacific Ocean, enormous as it is, was never truly a barrier to determined people. It was a highway, a connector, a medium through which cultures could meet and influence one another. The data scientists and geneticists involved in the project were keenly aware that they were contributing to a much larger story about human history. For Ioannidis, being able to use computational methods and genetic analysis to contribute in a meaningful way to our understanding of how people moved and met and mingled across the planet felt like participating in something important. These weren't just abstract questions about population genetics. These were questions about real people, about voyages and encounters and families, about courage and curiosity, and the drive to see what lay beyond the horizon. The study's publication in 2020 settled a question that had been open for decades. Yes, Polynesians and Native Americans had met. No, it wasn't just speculation or wishful thinking based on linguistic similarities and shared plants. The proof was written in the genome, clear and unambiguous to anyone who knew how to read it. The meeting happened around 1200 in the Common Era, 800 years before European ships entered the Pacific, at a time when both populations were engaged in their own projects of exploration and settlement. But even as this fundamental question was answered, new questions emerged. The genetic data could prove that contact happened, and it could tell you when it happened, and it could even point toward which Native American population was involved. What it couldn't tell you was where exactly the meeting took place. Did South Americans somehow make it across thousands of miles of open ocean to reach Polynesian islands? Or did Polynesians sail all the way to the coast of South America? And if they met, what was that encounter like? Was it friendly, hostile, curious, fearful? Did people choose to travel together, or were some taken against their will? These were questions that DNA alone couldn't answer. But the genetic evidence at least pointed the way toward asking better questions, more specific questions grounded in solid proof rather than speculation. The story of when Polynesians met South Americans had taken a giant leap forward, from mystery to established fact. Now it was time to dig deeper into the details of who met whom and where and how. Chapter 3. The Zenu Connection. Knowing that Polynesians and Native Americans met 800 years ago was remarkable enough, but the genetic data held an even more precise secret. The DNA sequences didn't just point vaguely toward South America as a continent. They pointed to a specific region, a specific coast, and ultimately to a specific people. The indigenous population whose genetic signature appeared in modern Polynesians came from the coastal regions of what is now Colombia. More specifically, when the researchers compared the Polynesian DNA segments against samples from 15 different indigenous groups living along the Pacific coast of Latin America, they found the closest match to one particular group, the Zenu people. This was extraordinary precision. The Pacific coast of South America stretches for thousands of miles, home to dozens of distinct indigenous cultures, each with their own languages, traditions, and genetic signatures shaped by thousands of years of history. The fact that modern genetic analysis could pinpoint not just a general region, but an actual people group demonstrated just how far the science had advanced. It was like being handed a historical detective case that had gone cold centuries ago, and suddenly finding a fingerprint that matched exactly one person in a database of suspects. The Zenu people lived in the coastal regions of what we now call Colombia, particularly in areas that would have provided access to the Pacific Ocean. This identification immediately raised fascinating questions. Why the Zenu specifically? What was it about their location, their culture, or their maritime practices that would have led to this encounter with Polynesians? And perhaps most intriguingly, what does it tell us that the genetic match points to Colombia rather than to Peru, the region that many researchers had assumed would be the most likely contact point? The team's comparison against 15 indigenous groups from Mexico to Chile revealed the Zenu as the closest match, surprising those who had expected Peru to be the source. But the genetic data didn't care about prior assumptions. The uniformity of these genetic signatures confirmed what the data had established: a single contact event involving one specific population. What we know about the Zenu people themselves comes primarily from archaeological evidence and from Spanish colonial accounts written centuries after this contact with Polynesians would have occurred. The Zenu were accomplished in working with gold and other metals, creating intricate objects that demonstrated both technical skill and artistic sophistication. They built complex hydraulic systems to manage water in their territories, showing engineering knowledge adapted to their specific environment. They constructed raised agricultural fields and channels that allowed them to farm in wetland areas, revealing sophisticated understanding of hydrology and landscape management. Their settlements showed organized planning, and their artifacts revealed long-distance trade networks with other indigenous groups in the region. They were clearly not a simple or primitive society, but a complex culture with its own achievements and adaptations to life on the northern Pacific coast of South America. The archaeological record suggests they had watercraft suitable for coastal navigation and fishing, though the extent of their maritime capabilities remains uncertain. What is certain is that they were a thriving coastal people with the skills and knowledge to exploit marine resources and navigate their local waters. Yet here's what the genetic evidence couldn't tell the researchers, no matter how sophisticated their analysis became. The DNA sequences revealed who these South Americans were in terms of their genetic ancestry, but they couldn't reveal the individual people involved, their names, their motivations, their experiences. The genes showed that people with Zenu ancestry met people with Polynesian ancestry and had children together. But they couldn't show whether this happened through friendship or force, through mutual attraction or coercion, through choice or circumstance. The genetic data pointed to the coastal regions of Colombia, and specifically to people ancestrally related to the modern Zenu population. But what it couldn't show was where exactly the first meeting took place, or how it came about. The ongoing debate about whether Polynesians sailed to Colombia or whether some other scenario unfolded couldn't be settled by DNA alone. What the genetics had accomplished was identifying who met whom. The rest of the story required other evidence. What made the identification of the Zenu particularly valuable for future research was that it gave other scientists specific direction for where to look for additional evidence. Archaeologists working in Colombia could now search with renewed focus for any artifacts or cultural elements that might show Polynesian influence, though 800 years of subsequent history would make such traces difficult to detect. Linguists could examine whether any words in Zenu-related languages might show connections to Polynesian languages, beyond the already known sweet potato connection. Anthropologists could look more carefully at cultural practices, though again, the passage of 8 centuries and the devastating impact of European colonization on indigenous South American cultures would make this challenging. The identification also opened questions about what has been lost to history. The Spanish encountered the Zenu as a powerful and prosperous people, but the colonial period devastated their population and disrupted their cultural continuity. How much knowledge about their maritime traditions, their coastal navigation, their relationship with the ocean was lost in that catastrophe? Did the Zenu themselves preserve any memory of this trans-Pacific connection in oral traditions that didn't survive colonization? The genetic evidence revealed a chapter of Zenu mystery that the Zenu themselves might not have known about, erased by time and tragedy. The genetic identification also provided a framework for thinking about the encounter in more human terms. These weren't abstract populations meeting in some theoretical space. These were Zenu individuals, people with families and lives and stories, who somehow came into contact with Polynesian individuals who also had families and lives and stories. Somewhere, whether on a Colombian beach or a Polynesian island, or perhaps somewhere in between, people from these two cultures spent time together, communicated somehow despite having no shared language, and formed relationships intimate enough to result in children. Those children, carrying DNA from both populations, became part of Polynesian communities. The genetic evidence showed that this mixed ancestry spread through eastern Polynesia, as those first-generation descendants and their own children married and had families. The admixture became woven into the genetic fabric of the region, persisting across generations until modern researchers could detect it with sophisticated computational analysis. The precision of identifying the Zenu also highlighted just how powerful modern genomic tools had become. A generation earlier, this kind of specificity would have been impossible. Researchers might have been able to say that some Native American ancestry was present, but pinpointing it to a specific indigenous group from a specific region based on comparing modern DNA samples would have been beyond the available technology. The advancement in sequencing capabilities, in computational analysis, and in the size of comparative genetic databases had made possible discoveries that previous generations of researchers could only dream about. The researchers had not only shown that contact occurred, not only dated when it occurred, but now identified exactly which South American population was involved. Each layer of analysis had added precision to the picture. From some Native American ancestry exists in some Polynesians to this ancestry came from a single contact event around 1200 CE involving people from coastal Colombia, specifically the Zenu. Each refinement transformed vague possibility into historical fact. For the descendants of both populations, the Zenu identification carried different meanings. For Polynesian communities, it added specificity to a story about their ancestors' voyaging capabilities and the connections they forged across vast distances. For people of Zenu descent, it revealed an unexpected chapter in their history, a connection to the Pacific that no oral tradition or written record had preserved. The genetic echo of an 800-year-old encounter had survived even when the memory and the stories had not. The identification of the Zenu also served as a reminder of how much history remains hidden, how many human stories have been lost to time but might still be recoverable through new methods and new technologies. The meeting between Polynesians and the Zenu people was never recorded in any written document, never passed down in any surviving oral tradition that modern researchers could access, never depicted in any artwork that archaeologists had found. Without the genetic evidence, this chapter of human history would have remained completely unknown, just one of countless encounters between peoples that happened, mattered to the individuals involved, and then faded from memory. Now, thanks to the persistence of DNA and the ingenuity of modern genetics, we know it happened. We know approximately when it happened. We know who was involved, at least in terms of their ancestral populations. What remains mysterious, and perhaps always will, are the human details. The individual faces, the personal choices, the specific circumstances that brought these particular people together across one of the greatest expanses of ocean on Earth. The genes have given us the outline of the story, with remarkable precision pointing to the Zenu people of coastal Colombia as the South American population who encountered Polynesians. The rest remains for our imagination to fill in, guided by what we know about both Polynesian and Zenu cultures, about human nature, and about the extraordinary things people are capable of when they venture beyond the horizon. Chapter 4. Where the Ocean Decides. For anyone who had been following the debate about Polynesian and South American contact over the years, Easter Island seemed like the obvious answer to where these two peoples would have met. Easter Island, known to its inhabitants as Rapa Nui, sits 2,200 miles off the coast of South America, making it the closest inhabited Polynesian island to the American continent. If you were plotting contact points on a map using nothing but geography and common sense, you would draw a line from the South American coast directly to Easter Island. The island's massive stone statues, the moai, had captivated the world's imagination for centuries, and there had been speculation for years about whether contact with South Americans might have influenced the island's culture. Some researchers had pointed to specific cultural practices, like the Birdman competition, that seemed to echo traditions from Andean cultures. So when the new comprehensive genetic analysis was being designed, many people expected it would simply confirm what seemed obvious. Easter Island was where Polynesians and South Americans first encountered each other. The genetic data, however, told a completely different story. When the researchers analyzed the DNA segments that carried Native American ancestry, they could trace backward through time to identify not just when the mixing happened, but where it happened first. By examining ancestry across different Polynesian islands and calculating back through approximately 28 generations, they could pinpoint the origin. The answer surprised almost everyone involved in the research. The initial contact point wasn't Easter Island at all. It was Fatu Hiva, a small island in the South Marquesas archipelago, somewhere around 1150 to 1200 in the Common Era. This finding forced researchers to completely rethink their assumptions about how this encounter unfolded. To understand why this was so surprising, you need to picture the geography involved. The Marquesas Islands lie roughly 3,500 miles west of South America. Easter Island, by comparison, is only 2,200 miles from the continent. If you were trying to reach Polynesia from South America, whether by deliberate navigation or by accident, Easter Island is significantly closer. You would have to pass relatively near Easter Island to get to the Marquesas. Why would the first contact happen at the more distant location? The researchers found their answer in the same force that Heyerdahl had relied on for his Kon-Tiki voyage: ocean currents and prevailing winds. The Pacific Ocean is constantly in motion, with massive currents sweeping along the South American coast, and then flowing westward across the open ocean. These aren't gentle streams. They're powerful rivers within the ocean itself, capable of carrying anything caught in them for thousands of miles. The prevailing winds follow similar patterns, pushing consistently from east to west across this part of the Pacific. One of the lead researchers explained it with elegant simplicity. That's where the winds and currents will take you if you're drifting. If people in boats plying coastal trade routes along Colombia or Ecuador were blown off course or caught in the wrong current, if they found themselves being carried out to sea with no way to fight back to shore, the ocean itself would determine their destination. And that destination, following the natural flow of water and wind, would be the region where the South Marquesas lie. This explanation opened up plausible scenarios for how the encounter might have happened. A Zenu trading vessel or fishing boat working the Colombian coast could have been pushed out to sea by a storm. Once caught in the current, with the technology available to coastal South American peoples at that time, they would have had little choice but to go where the ocean took them. The current would carry them westward, day after day, across an expanse of ocean far greater than anything they had imagined. The journey would have been brutal, but if even a few survived, the currents and winds would eventually deliver them to the eastern islands of Polynesia, specifically to the Marquesas. The alternative scenario was equally consistent with the evidence. Polynesian navigators had reached the Colombian coast, and then, on their return voyage, followed currents and winds that brought them to the South Marquesas. Either way, the South Marquesas location made sense once you understood the ocean dynamics involved. What made the genetic evidence particularly convincing was that the researchers could track how this ancestry spread after the initial contact. The data showed that admixture appeared first in the South Marquesas around 1150 to 1200, right around the time that Polynesians were settling that region. From there, the mixed population spread to other islands in central and eastern Polynesia. You could see it in the genetic signatures, like watching ripples spread across a pond from where a stone was thrown. The genes told a story of movement and settlement. People carrying both Polynesian and Zenu ancestry became part of the Marquesan population. Some of their descendants eventually migrated to other islands as Polynesians continued their expansion across the Pacific. Each time these descendants married and had children, the Zenu genetic signature got passed down and spread further. By the time Polynesians settled Easter Island, which the evidence suggested happened by at least 1200, some of the settlers apparently included people who already carried this mixed ancestry from the earlier contact in the Marquesas. The genetic analysis also revealed a later separate admixture event on Easter Island itself around 1380. There was also a fascinating alternative interpretation that some researchers considered. What if South Americans had reached the South Marquesas even before Polynesians arrived there? The timing of the genetic contact, around 1150 to 1200, coincided almost exactly with when Polynesians were settling the Marquesas. As one researcher noted, the native South Americans may have come to the South Marquesas just before the Polynesians did. In this scenario, a group of Zenu people cast adrift from the Colombian coast had made it to these islands and were already there when the first Polynesian settlers arrived. This would explain why the genetic signature appeared so early in the Marquesan settlement sequence. The Polynesians would have discovered islands that already had a small population of South Americans living on them, people who had been there long enough to establish themselves, but not long enough to have developed a sustainable population on their own. The Polynesians and the South Americans would have encountered each other not as visitors from distant lands meeting on neutral ground, but as settlers arriving to find unexpected prior inhabitants. Given that Polynesians eventually became the dominant population throughout the islands, such an encounter might have resulted in the South American genetic contribution becoming incorporated into the Polynesian population through intermarriage. The identification of the South Marquesas as the first contact point meant that researchers needed to reconsider the role of Easter Island in this story. For decades, Easter Island had been the focus of speculation about Polynesian-American contact, partly because of its proximity to South America, and partly because of its unique cultural features. The new genetic evidence didn't diminish Easter Island's importance, but it did place it in a different context. Easter Island wasn't the beginning of the story, it was a later chapter, part of an ongoing saga of contact and mixing that had already begun elsewhere. What the South Marquesas finding ultimately demonstrated was that the Pacific Ocean, vast and seemingly empty, was actually a space crisscrossed with invisible highways of current and wind that determined where people would go once they entered its waters. The first contact between Polynesians and South Americans didn't happen at the most geographically convenient location. It happened where the ocean itself directed the encounter, following pathways carved by water and air moving across thousands of miles of open sea. For the people involved, whether they were Zenu fishermen caught in an unwanted current or Polynesian voyagers returning from an expedition to South America, the South Marquesas became the stage for one of history's most remarkable cross-cultural encounters. Two populations from opposite sides of the Pacific met on tiny islands in the middle of the world's largest ocean, and somehow formed relationships that produced children whose genetic legacy would persist for 800 years. The fact that this happened first in the South Marquesas rather than on Easter Island made the story even more remarkable, a reminder that sometimes the ocean decides where history begins. Chapter 5. The Ocean's Invisible Map. To truly understand how Polynesians and South Americans could have met 800 years ago, you need to understand something that sounds almost like magic to modern ears: how Polynesian navigators crossed thousands of miles of open ocean without maps, without compasses, without sextants, without any of the instruments we think of as essential for ocean navigation. They found tiny islands scattered across 16 million square miles of the Pacific Ocean. They did it deliberately, repeatedly, successfully. And they did it using nothing but their senses, their knowledge, and skills honed over generations. Imagine yourself in an outrigger canoe in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. You're surrounded by water in every direction, nothing but the endless rise and fall of waves stretching to the horizon. There are no landmarks, no signposts, no way to radio for help if you get lost. The island you're trying to find is perhaps 50 miles long and 20 miles wide, a tiny speck in an ocean that covers almost 1/3 of Earth's surface. Getting lost means death for you and everyone with you. The foundation of Polynesian navigation was the stars, but not in the way you might imagine if you've seen European navigators using instruments to measure stellar positions. Polynesian navigators didn't calculate, they knew. They memorized the rising and setting positions of hundreds of stars on the horizon, creating a compass of 32 points or more around the complete circle of the sky. Each star had its place, its path, its season. On a clear night, a skilled navigator would watch the stars rise from the eastern horizon, track them across the sky, and watch them set in the west. By keeping a particular star on the same relative bearing, rising or setting at a specific point on the horizon, a navigator could maintain a constant heading across hundreds of miles of ocean. When that star climbed too high to be useful, another star would take its place, and then another, creating a chain of celestial guideposts that stretched through the night. But stars only work when the sky is clear, and the Pacific can be cloudy. A navigator needed other techniques, other ways of reading the environment that didn't depend on seeing the heavens. This is where the truly remarkable skills came into play. Polynesian navigators learned to read the ocean swells with extraordinary precision. Swells are different from waves. Waves are created by local winds, choppy and irregular. Swells are the deep, regular pulses of the ocean itself, massive movements of water that travel for thousands of miles from their point of origin. A swell generated by a storm near Antarctica might roll across the Pacific for weeks, maintaining its direction and rhythm even as it crosses the equator. These swells are always present, usually several different swell patterns intersecting at any given location. A Polynesian navigator would lie in the bottom of the canoe, feeling the rise and fall of different swells through the hull, distinguishing between them by their rhythm, their direction, their strength. He could tell which swell was coming from the southeast, which from the northeast, which was the deep ground swell from a distant storm, and which was the local chop from yesterday's wind. This information created a map in motion, a constantly shifting reference frame that remained consistent over vast distances. When an ocean swell encounters an island, it wraps around the island, bending its direction. It bounces back from the island's shore, creating a reflected swell traveling in the opposite direction. Where the incoming and reflected swells meet, they create interference patterns, places where the ocean surface becomes confused and choppy in distinctive ways. A navigator who understood these patterns could detect an island's presence from the disruption it caused in the swell field, even if the island was still below the horizon. Cloud formations provided another crucial navigation tool. Clouds behave differently over land than they do over open ocean. A lagoon would create a greenish reflection on the underside of clouds from sunlight reflecting off the shallow water. A heavily forested island might create a particular type of cloud that formed over the land in the late afternoon as the earth heated and created updrafts. Even the color and shape of clouds on the horizon could tell a navigator whether they were forming over ocean or land and roughly how far away that land might be. Then there were the birds. Certain seabird species venture far from land during the day to feed, but always return to their nesting sites before dark. If you saw these birds flying in a particular direction in the late afternoon, you could be confident that land lay in that direction. And, depending on the species, you could estimate roughly how far. Some birds ranged 30 miles from their nests. Others might go 50 or even 100 miles. The flight paths weren't random. Experienced navigators knew that certain species would head toward land with determination and purpose as evening approached. If you saw a frigate bird in the morning, it told you one thing about the distance to land. If you saw the same species in the evening heading steadily in one direction, it told you something much more specific. You could adjust your course to follow, confident that the bird was going home. The sun provided direction during the day, but not just through its east to west arc across the sky. The angle of the sun changed with latitude, climbing higher overhead as you approached the equator and sitting lower on the horizon as you moved toward the poles. A navigator who had memorized these patterns could estimate his latitude by the sun's height and adjust his course accordingly. This wasn't precise astronomical calculation. This was embodied knowledge, the kind of understanding that comes from spending your entire life on the ocean. All of these techniques work together, creating redundancy and confirmation. If the stars told you one thing, the swells should tell you the same thing. If the birds suggested an island to the north, the clouds should confirm it. A skilled navigator was constantly cross-checking, constantly comparing what different elements of the environment were telling him, building a comprehensive picture from multiple sources of information. The mental challenges were as demanding as the physical ones. A navigator needed to maintain awareness of the canoe's course and position constantly, day after day, sometimes for weeks at a time. There were no instruments to consult, no way to check your work except by the consistency of all the environmental signs you were reading. If you made an error, if you misread the swells or mistook one star for another, the mistake would compound over days and hundreds of miles. The training required to become a navigator began in childhood and might take decades to complete. Young apprentices would memorize chants that encoded navigational knowledge, listing stars and their rising points, describing the swell patterns around different islands, cataloging the flight ranges of different bird species. These chants served as mnemonic devices, turning abstract information into rhythmic poetry that could be remembered and recited. A navigator needed to carry libraries of information in his head, and the chants made that possible. Apprentices would practice on short inter-island voyages, learning to feel the swells, to recognize stars, to read the clouds. Even experienced navigators would refine their knowledge on every voyage, noting subtle patterns, adjusting their mental models based on new observations. This accumulation of knowledge across generations created a navigational tradition of extraordinary sophistication. The canoes themselves were remarkable pieces of technology. Polynesian voyaging canoes were sophisticated sailing vessels designed specifically for long-distance ocean travel. The classic design involved two hulls connected by a platform, creating a stable vessel that could carry supplies and still being fast enough to make long passages practical. These double-hulled canoes could be 60 feet long or larger, with sails woven from pandanus leaves. The design was incredibly seaworthy, able to handle the massive swells of the open Pacific without capsizing. The geographical achievement this enabled is hard to overstate. Polynesians settled New Zealand, a large landmass roughly the size of the British Isles, lying 4,500 miles southwest of Hawaii. They found and settled Hawaii itself, a small island chain sitting in the middle of the northern Pacific, 2,500 miles from the nearest other land. They reached Easter Island, 2,200 miles from South America in one direction, and 1,000 miles from the nearest Polynesian island in the other direction. These weren't accidents. These were deliberate voyages of discovery, navigation achievements that European sailors with compasses and charts wouldn't match for centuries. Consider what it meant to find Hawaii. You're sailing north from the Marquesas or the Society Islands, heading into an empty ocean. You have reason to think land might exist in that direction, perhaps based on the flight paths of birds seen during previous voyages, or stories passed down from earlier navigators. But you're sailing toward a target that covers perhaps 6,500 square miles in an ocean that covers 64 million square miles. You need to maintain your heading across more than 2,000 miles of ocean, and your target is less than 1/10 of 1% of the area you're crossing. The margin for error is almost non-existent. And yet Polynesians did it, found Hawaii, and settled it successfully. The return voyage was in some ways even more impressive. Once you'd found a new island, you needed to be able to sail back to your home island to report the discovery and organize larger settlement expeditions. This meant memorizing the reverse course, creating a mental map that worked in both directions. Navigators developed sophisticated understanding of how courses related to each other, how the environmental signs would appear different when sailing in opposite directions, how to adjust for seasonal changes in wind and current. Curious, yet authoritative documentary tone. This navigational mastery is what made it plausible, even likely, that Polynesians reached South America. By 1200 in the Common Era, Polynesian navigators had already accomplished voyages that were at least as difficult as sailing from Easter Island to the coast of Colombia or Ecuador. They had proven they could find small targets across vast distances. The question wasn't whether they could reach South America. The question was whether they did, and the genetic evidence had now answered that question with a definitive yes. When you understand the depth of Polynesian navigational knowledge, the South American contact becomes not an unlikely accident, but an almost inevitable result of systematic exploration. These were people who had made the ocean their home, who understood its patterns more intimately than most modern sailors could imagine. They had the skills, the technology, and, based on their track record of discovery, certainly the curiosity and courage to venture east from their furthest islands toward a continent whose existence they may have suspected from signs they'd observed at sea. Chapter 6. The Pushback. The announcement of the genetic study in the summer of 2020 made headlines around the world. Major newspapers and science magazines ran stories about how DNA had finally proven that Polynesians and Native Americans met 800 years before European contact. The findings seemed definitive, the kind of scientific breakthrough that settles long-standing debates once and for all. But within the scientific community, particularly among archaeologists and specialists who had spent their careers studying the Pacific region, the reaction was far more complicated. Almost immediately after publication, criticism began to surface, not attacking the genetic data itself, but questioning how it had been interpreted and what it actually proved. The controversy started with a name, Thor Heyerdahl. For many archaeologists and Pacific specialists, the study's citation of Heyerdahl's framework was a red flag that suggested the geneticists might not fully understand the history of Pacific archaeology, or why his long-debunked theories about South American settlement of Polynesia remained problematic. Mole Guillaume, an archaeologist specializing in the Pacific region, noted immediately after publication that the study had been based on Heyerdahl's framework without deep engagement with archaeologists actually working in the region or with biological anthropologists and geneticists who specialized specifically in the Pacific and French Polynesia. This criticism highlighted a broader tension that runs through modern interdisciplinary science. The genetic researchers were experts in genomics, in computational analysis, in population genetics. They had developed sophisticated methods for analyzing DNA and drawing conclusions about ancestry and mixing events. But they were not experts in Pacific archaeology, in the specific histories and cultures of Polynesian peoples, or in the decades of scholarship that had been built up by researchers working in the region. The concern was that geneticists were arriving with powerful new tools, but without sufficient understanding of the archaeological and anthropological context into which they were inserting their findings. The methodological approach also drew criticism. The study was based entirely on DNA from modern populations, people living today in Polynesia and South America. These were all contemporary people whose genetic heritage reflected not just ancient contact, but also centuries of subsequent history. Colonial-era mixing, post-European population movements, the devastating demographic collapses that affected many indigenous populations after European contact, all of these events had shaped the genetic landscape that the researchers were trying to read backward through time. Ancient DNA, extracted from bones of people who lived and died before European contact, would have provided more direct evidence. If you could find Native American genetic signatures in the bones of Polynesians who died in 1300 or 1400, that would be unambiguous proof of pre-European contact. The problem was that ancient DNA from Pacific Islands was extremely difficult to obtain and analyze. The tropical climate, with its heat and humidity, destroys DNA rapidly. The few studies that had attempted to use ancient DNA from the region had struggled with degraded samples and limited data. And here was where things got really controversial. In 2017, just 3 years before the comprehensive genetic study made its headlines, a different team, led by Pontus Skoglund, had published their own genetic analysis in the journal Current Biology, focused specifically on Easter Island. That earlier study had taken the ancient DNA approach, analyzing genetic material from 5 individuals who had lived on the island before and after European contact. Their conclusion was stark. They found no Native American admixture whatsoever, 0. The people they tested appeared to be entirely of Polynesian ancestry. How could 2 genetic studies, both using sophisticated analysis methods, both published in respected journals, reach such different conclusions? The 2017 team had found no South American ancestry in ancient Easter Islanders. The 2020 team found clear evidence of South American ancestry in modern Easter Islanders and other Polynesians. Both couldn't be completely right. The defenders of the newer study pointed out that 5 individuals was an incredibly small sample size. Maybe those particular 5 people just happened not to carry the admixture. Maybe the mixed ancestry individuals lived in different parts of the island or belonged to different social groups that weren't represented in the ancient burial sites that had been excavated. Maybe the ancient DNA was so degraded that the South American segments, which were quite short to begin with, simply couldn't be detected reliably. These were all reasonable explanations for why ancient DNA might miss a signal that modern DNA could detect. But the critics countered that this was exactly the problem with relying on modern DNA. When you're analyzing people living today, you're looking at genetic patterns that have been shaped by 800 years of history that you can't directly observe. You're making assumptions about population continuity, about who married whom over dozens of generations, about migration patterns and demographic changes for which there's limited historical record. You're using mathematical models to infer what happened in the past based on genetic patterns in the present, and those models rely on assumptions that might not hold true. The question of where the contact actually occurred remained a particular sore point. The genetic data could show that mixing had happened, and it could estimate when it happened, but it couldn't definitively prove where the meeting took place. The researchers had made reasonable arguments based on ocean currents and the pattern of how the ancestry spread through different islands, but these were inferences, not direct observations. The genes themselves didn't come with GPS coordinates. Some archaeologists pointed out that if there had really been significant contact between South Americans and Polynesians, especially if it involved South Americans reaching and living on Polynesian islands, you would expect to find archaeological evidence beyond just the genetic signature. You would expect to see South American artifacts, distinctive pottery styles or tool types, architectural elements, or other material culture that couldn't be explained by independent invention. Yet, despite decades of archaeological work on Easter Island and other eastern Polynesian islands, no such clear evidence had been found, besides the botanical evidence of the sweet potato. There was also concern about how the findings were being communicated to the public. News headlines proclaimed that the study vindicated Heyerdahl or proved that South Americans reached Polynesia. But many of the researchers involved in the genetic study themselves had stated they thought Polynesian voyaging to South America was the more likely explanation. The nuance was getting lost in translation from scientific paper to public communication, and some archaeologists worried this would breathe new life into discredited theories about Pacific settlement. The criticism wasn't universal. Some researchers praised the study as excellent and exciting work that expanded understanding beyond just Easter Island. They appreciated that it provided the first conclusive genetic evidence of contact, moving the question from whether contact happened to understanding how and where it happened. They acknowledged that genetics had contributed something genuinely new to the conversation, evidence that couldn't have been obtained through traditional archaeological methods. But even supportive researchers often added important caveats. One scientist noted that while the genetic findings were fascinating, only ancient DNA could provide direct evidence of the encounter. Everything based on modern DNA was inference, mathematical modeling applied to contemporary populations. Another researcher stressed that it was too early to make sweeping conclusions about Easter Island's history based on this evidence. The genetic data opened up new questions, but it didn't answer all of them, and it needed to be integrated carefully with archaeological and anthropological evidence rather than being treated as the final word. The question of community engagement also arose in the critiques. The researchers had indeed visited communities, explained their study, and obtained consent for sample collection. This was far better than the extractive research practices of earlier eras, when scientists would show up, take what they wanted, and leave without any benefit or even acknowledgement to the communities involved. But some critics suggested that consultation should have extended beyond just sample collection, to include deeper engagement with local historians, traditional knowledge holders, and indigenous scholars, who might have perspectives on contact and settlement that weren't captured in either genetic data or Western archaeological frameworks. There was a particular irony in the controversy that several observers noted. Genetics was supposed to provide objective scientific evidence that could cut through decades of speculation and debate. The DNA doesn't lie, as the saying goes. It provides a factual record independent of interpretation or bias. Yet here was a genetic study that had produced what seemed like clear results, and the scientific community was still arguing about what it meant, whether the methods were sound, and whether the conclusions were justified. The question of community engagement also arose in the critiques. The researchers had indeed visited communities, explained their study, and obtained consent for sample collection. This was far better than the extractive research practices of earlier eras, when scientists would show up, take what they wanted, and leave, without any benefit or even acknowledgement to the communities involved. But some critics suggested that consultation should have extended beyond just sample collection, to include deeper engagement with local historians, traditional knowledge holders, and indigenous scholars who might have perspectives on contact and settlement that weren't captured in either genetic data or Western archaeological frameworks. There was a particular irony in the controversy that several observers noted. Genetics was supposed to provide objective scientific evidence that could cut through decades of speculation and debate. The DNA doesn't lie, as the saying goes. It provides a factual record independent of interpretation or bias. Yet here was a genetic study that had produced what seemed like clear results, and the scientific community was still arguing about what it meant, whether the methods were sound, and whether the conclusions were justified.
Curious yet authoritative documentary tone. This reflected a maturing understanding of what genetic data can and cannot tell us. The base pairs of DNA are indeed factual, but interpreting what those sequences mean for human history requires making choices about methods, about which populations to sample, about which mathematical models to use for analysis, about how to account for subsequent history that might have altered genetic patterns. Two researchers looking at the same genetic data might reach different conclusions based on reasonable differences in how they approached these interpretive questions. Some specialists in Pacific studies felt that the most valuable contribution of the genetic study wasn't actually its specific claims about when and where contact occurred, but rather its demonstration that contact definitely happened. That fundamental question, debated for decades, now had a clear answer. Yes, these two populations met. Yes, they had children together. Yes, this happened long before Europeans arrived. Everything beyond that remained open to interpretation, debate, and further investigation. The controversy also highlighted how scientific knowledge advances through debate and criticism, not just through publishing findings. The genetic study was peer-reviewed before publication, meaning other scientists had examined the methods and approved them as sound. But peer review happens before publication, usually by a handful of reviewers chosen for their expertise. The real test comes after publication, when the broader scientific community can scrutinize the work, attempt to replicate findings, and argue about interpretations. This broader community review, though sometimes contentious, is how science refines its understanding over time. The archaeological critics argued that answering deeper questions would require collaboration between geneticists and specialists in Pacific history, archaeology, and anthropology. It would need careful excavation looking for material evidence of contact. It would benefit from engagement with indigenous knowledge and oral traditions that might contain fragments of memory about these encounters. It would demand humility about what any single line of evidence, even powerful genetic data, could prove on its own. As the dust settled on the initial controversy, what emerged was a more nuanced picture than the breathless headlines had suggested. The genetic study had made a real contribution, providing strong evidence for contact that moved the question forward significantly. But it hadn't ended the debate. If anything, it had intensified it, raising new questions about methods and interpretation, even as it answered old questions about whether contact occurred. The science was sound, but science is always provisional, always subject to revision as new evidence emerges and new perspectives challenge existing interpretations. The story of when Polynesians met South Americans had gained a crucial new chapter written in genetic code, but the full narrative remained unfinished, waiting for additional evidence, better methods, and perhaps most importantly, more inclusive collaboration between all the disciplines and communities who had stakes in understanding this remarkable moment. The story of when Polynesians met South Americans reminds us that the world's largest ocean was never truly a barrier. 800 years ago, people from coastal Colombia encountered Polynesians, probably in the South Marquesas, leaving a genetic signature that persists to this day. Whether it was Polynesian navigators reaching the Americas with their extraordinary seafaring skills, or Zenu people carried westward by currents and winds, the meeting happened. The meeting happened. The DNA proves it. But perhaps the deeper lesson is about what remains hidden in history, waiting to be discovered. For centuries, this encounter was completely forgotten, preserved only in the cells of descendants who had no idea their ancestors had bridged one of Earth's greatest distances. Today's tools can reveal what yesterday's memories couldn't preserve. Yet, even with genetic proof, questions remain about how these peoples met, where exactly it happened, and what their encounter meant to those who lived it. Some mysteries may never be fully solved, but the search itself expands our understanding of human courage, capability, and connection. Thank you for listening.